Welcome to Heart of Terror. I'm your guide through the chilling tales of horror, from spine-tingling encounters to bone-chilling mysteries. Subscribe and hit the bell for your weekly dose of haunted stories. Let the horror bane. I'm not afraid of ghosts, but it's not because I don't believe in them. Ido. In fact, I know they exist. I've been seeing them all my life, Haley Joel style, and by now I've come to take them for granted. There's certain rules to how I see them, which I've observed. I only ever see each ghost in one place, the very spot where they died. I never see them doing anything other than reliving the moment of their death. To me, that has made them horrifying, terrible to behold, but also sympathetic in a way. There's 3 ghosts in particular that I want to tell you about tonight, the 3 I've seen most often throughout my life. The first is the one I've always called the hanging grandfather, and I saw him for the first time that I can remember when I was about 4 or 5, and I woke up in the middle of the night and there he was, hanging from a rafter, his eyes bulging out of their sockets and yet still staring at me. I know he's my grandfather for a couple of reasons. First, like any curious child, I'd learned things about my parents just by listening when they thought I wasn't. I knew the house I was growing up in was the same one my father had grown up in. They'd made no secret of that, but what they never told me was that my father's father had killed himself here. My grandfather's suicide was something I learned to live with on my own, just as I learned to live with the ghost of the hanging grandfather watching over me as I fell asleep. In high school, I met my first girlfriend and my second recurring ghost. That was not a coincidence. Her house was just as haunted as mine. She shared the upstairs bedroom with her sisters, and her unemployed father usually occupied the couch. So when the 2 of us wanted some privacy, we had to sneak down to the basement. It was unfinished, but in addition to her father's tool bench and the water heater, it held a TV set with a VCR, a shelf of VHS tapes, and an uncomfortable couch that nonetheless served our purposes. Oh, and it also had 3 ghosts. They, more than the hanging grandfather, were responsible for my nonchalant attitude towards ghosts. After all, when your teenage sex life depends, your ability to make out with some chick with 3 dead bodies that only you can see in the corner of the room, well, you learn to be pretty open-minded pretty quickly. These I called the twitching women. The 3 of them sat slumped in the far corner of the basement, the darkest one, so it was thankfully hard for me to see the details. Their cause of death was obvious. Each of their heads had been crushed in, bashed into the cement walls beyond recognition, but their arms and legs still lingered in their death throes every time I followed my girlfriend down there. The last ghost I want to tell you about it by far the worst. It's the one I'm looking at right now as I type this. It's huddled in the middle of the living room of my apartment with its knees drawn up to its chest and its arms wrapped around them and staring at me ceaselessly. It watches me from the moment I get home in the afternoon to the time I go to bed. I call it the Flayed Man, after the sigil of House Bolton from Game of Thrones. That's what he is, though. A cowering corpse with its skin all torn off in strips, yet somehow still alive through it all until the end, when he died in excruciating pain and fear. As horrifying as the Flayed Man is, the first time I saw him I wasn't scared. I was angry. I immediately got on the phone with my real estate agent. You probably don't know this, don't need to know this, but they are required to tell you about any deaths that have taken place in a property you're looking to rent or own. And I always ask, wouldn't you? If you could see ghosts reliving their dying moments every time you walked in the door, wouldn't you avoid living where anyone had died? To her credit, my real estate agent handled the situation well. I admit, I was a little rude to her. It wasn't her fault. She told me what she'd known about the property, and even though she didn't understand my certainty about the horrible homicide that had taken place there, she promised to look into it. About a week passed without any word from her. I settled into my life as best I could, going about my daily routine and ignoring the Flayed Man's pain baleful gaze that followed me relentlessly about my apartment. I wasn't afraid, exactly, but he unsettled me as you can probably imagine, and I needed to get away. My reprieve came in the most unfortunate form. A midnight phone call from my mother informing me of my father's death. I went home for that, of course, took a leave of absence from my new job to comfort my mother and help out with the funeral arrangements. It was a small, closed casket affair. We're a small family, so the service was sparsely attended. I got up, said a few words commemorating the man and what he'd meant to me, and we lowered him into the ground. While I was in town, out of sentimentality, I thought I'd look up my old girlfriend. We'd fallen out of touch when we went off to college, and I wanted to know how she was doing. Don't get the wrong idea about me. I wasn't looking to use my father's suicide as an opportunity for a booty call. Her father met me at the door, a shadow of the man I remembered. He seemed to have aged 30 years in the tin that had actually passed. No longer heavy-set, his empty skin fell down his face in folds, and when I asked about my old girlfriend, his daughter, he almost started to cry. She meant a lot to me, so I'm going to type this as quickly and concisely as I can, because I don't like to dwell on it. 3 years ago, at Christmas, her father finally got a job playing Santa at the local mall. He'd certainly always had the belly for it. One Wednesday afternoon, when all 3 of his daughters had come home for the holiday, he was out working, taking pictures with babies on his lap when a man, at least, they assume it was a man, came to the house with a shotgun. We don't know what he wanted or why he did it, but he forced the 3 of them down into the basement, and he blew their heads off, one at a time. My blood ran cold upon hearing the story. A chill ran down my spine as I remembered the twitching women, spilling out their lifeblood and jerking about all those years ago as I slaked my lust on the couch just feet away. I excused myself as fast as I could and returned home, where my mother sat with a blanket over her feet, staring away into nothing. I don't even remember how I brought it up, but I must have worked it into our conversation. I remarked on how sad it was and how ironic that not only had my father chosen to end his life, but that he chose the very same manner his own father had taken, hanging. My mother's eyes came alive, but only briefly, and only long enough to turn them in my direction as she explained something that I had feared, something I hadn't dared dream she would explain. You see, my grandfather didn't hang himself. He wandered out into the forest out back, further than I had ever ventured as a child, and he had cut his own wrists. By the time my father had found him, my mother told me the animals had gotten to him first. He was nothing more than a torn-up pile of meat. No, my father didn't kill himself the same way his father did. My father hanged himself in my bedroom. Despite my anxiety, I stayed with her a few more days, trying to coax her out of the shell that my father's suicide had left her in. Failed. I wish I could have left her with something to hold on to, some sort of hope. I'm back in my apartment now, typing up my story just in case someone out there might be suffering from the same affliction as me. I don't know how much time I have left. I'm not afraid of ghosts, but I'm not so sure whether or not they exist anymore. I know now that I've never actually seen one. The flayed man still sits in the middle of the room, watching me as I type. He's become familiar to me when I look into his eyes. I know that look. I've seen it before, when I'm facing my greatest doubts and demons, and I step into the bathroom and stare into my own eyes in the mirror.